tree. I am no tree. I am a tree.
Swamp Rip.
Ooh, hello my friends, hope you are well. Today I'll be showing you how I make the majority of the trees I use for dioramas and miniatures. And I won't say this is the absolute best technique for making the fastest or cheapest or best looking trees, but for me, it's the best balance between all of these factors, producing trees that don't take a great deal of effort or financial investment to make, and which also look pretty good. So let's do it. Right, the materials we'll be needing are as follows. Some wire, the thinner the better here, with 0.7mm floral wire being ideal, but thicker wire can still be useful. Some pliers or wire cutters for snipping the wire down, a hot glue gun with a bunch of glue sticks, some super glue and some PVA, some paints with cheap craft paints being more than adequate, a variety of flocks and foliages for adding the greenery, and finally I'll also be using a homemade texture paste, which is optional but helps to add a bit more realism to the trees, and I'll show you how to make this out of really cheap materials later on. So now we have all our materials together, I'll run through the basic process for anyone who doesn't want to watch a whole in-depth video about this, and then go through each step in a bit more detail for those of you hungry for some good nuggets of info. All you need to do is cut off some lengths of wire, just over twice as tall as you want your trees to be, fold them in half and twist them together into the main tree trunk. Next, start twisting out smaller offshoots of the wire to form branches, and then coat the entire thing in hot glue to cover the wire texture and bulk it up a bit. You can then add your optional texture paste to give it some rough barkiness if you want, and then paint the trees up with some good woody colours. Finally, add your foliage using a little bit of super glue, soak in some watered down PVA for added durability, and then dust on a little bit of fine flock before it dries to add a bit of colour variation to the crown of the tree. Boom! Easy peasy. So yeah, for anyone who wanted a quick version, thank you for watching and see you soon. And for anyone else, here are some tips and tricks to get the most out of each of these steps and produce some lovely looking trees. Now, as mentioned a moment ago, you want to be cutting your wire to just over twice as tall as you want your trees to be. This is because you'll be folding it in half and then losing a little bit of height when you twist them into the trunk and the branches. And there's no magic number of how many pieces of wire you should include in your trees, as that will depend on how thick you want them to be. But if you want your trees to be thick, then you can also bulk it up with some heavier gauge stuff like this steel wire I got at a hardware shop. I wouldn't use this thicker wire on its own though usually, as it's harder to twist off into smaller branches, especially if you want little offshoots on the ends. And generally speaking, I'd say it's usually a bit better to keep your wire skeletons a lot thinner than you want your finished trees to be, as you'll be bulking them out of your hot glue gun in a moment anyway. For making the branches, just take a few pieces of wire and twist them together like you did the trunk, and then snip away any of the excess with your clippers. You can use these little offcuts to make tiny trees and bushes using the same principles in this video, or just scatter them into your morning porridge for a nice sharp surprise. Depending on the look you're going for, you might want to twist your branches out at different points. For something like a pine tree for example, you want branches shooting out all the way up. So I twist the trunk a bit first, twist off some branches around the sides, twist a little bit more of the trunk, do more branches, and then repeat this process all the way up. Once you have the wire skeletons for your trees looking how you want, it's time to start adding the hot glue. And this next step is very simple. You just want to cover up every little bit of wire using your hot glue gun, and if you wanted to, you could use clay or something similar instead. The concept remains the same, you know, make the skeleton from wire and then bulk it out with something else. But I go for hot glue as it sets really quickly, it's cheap, and it's just a bit easier to work with. Also, trees are usually quite lumpy and bumpy like my brain is, so the uneven finish from the hot glue helps to sell the appearance of natural uneven trees, as opposed to the perfectly straight and unblemished sticks that you often see with the ready-made plastic tree armatures you can buy. If you want skinnier trees and branches, squeeze out your glue really slowly and be careful to give the wire a very thin coating, just enough to cover it up and add some texture. And obviously, if you want some big old gnarly looking trees, just glob it on with pure reckless abandon. A big old blob here, another one there, and all of a sudden you've got some nice bulging tree bodies. As a last touch, I'll usually glob on a bit extra at the base of the tree, whether I'm going for a skinny or a thick one, just because the base is usually the widest point of the trunk and it helps to look a bit more realistic overall. And your trees will be looking quite weird at this point, like some ghostly ectoplasmic creatures, but trust in the process, they'll start to come together with the following steps. Right, so when all your hot gluing is done, you could go straight to painting if you want, but I like to add some texture paste to the trees to give them that rough, barky look. If you've seen my homemade mud video, this stuff is almost the exact same. I take some sand, some PVA, some filler and some paint and mix those all together. The only real difference is I use a lot more sand in this mixture and I don't sieve out any of the larger bits, as those give the tree a nice coarse grainy texture. And just like the hot glue, whack this on all over, making sure to cover up everything as best you can. Doesn't matter if you have the odd bit of wire or glue poking out, as we'll be painting them properly in a moment anyway, but it helps to cover up as much surface area as possible with this mixture. You can also experiment with adding different material, textures and whatever into this mixture, but I find that the coarse builder sand usually gives the best results and it's super cheap. This coarse sand might be a bit too much for very small trees though, and could potentially throw off the scale, in which case you might want to opt for a finer medium. When that dries, they're looking much more gnarled and much more gnarled and barky, and they're ready to be painted. So, although I mixed paint into our texture paste, I'm still going to base coat our trees as you normally would, as the texture paste has quite a dry and washed out finish from the filler. I'll usually start with a bog standard brown colour, whatever looks good to you, and then I'll give the surface a dry brushing with a much lighter brown colour to pick up that bark texture. For trees where most of the branches and trunk are going to be obscured by the foliage, like this pine tree, I'll then chuck on a quick dark wash to bring in some depth, and then maybe a dry brush again if it goes too dark. That's all you need to do for these. If your branches and trunk aren't going to be visible, you don't want to waste your time trying to make them look perfect. Just get them looking good, then move on to your foliage. But for your larger trees or ones where the trunk and branches are visible, we can go a bit further to make them look good. We start with the same base coat, dry brush and dark wash combo, but this time I'll also chuck on some green and ochre washes too, applying them sporadically and then wicking away the excess with a bit of tissue. And dabbing off the wash like this is great because it leaves behind a nice subtle coloured hue which can look like moss or other natural growth, so don't go over the top with your washes, make sure you dab away enough of it, otherwise you'll be left with some big bold splotches of colour which look unnatural. And once those washes have dried, I then go around and stipple on some different shades of green to add to that natural mossy look most trees have on their surface, usually starting with a darker green, then a mid green, and finally a very pale green used sparingly. The very last thing I do with painting is add a final dry brush using our original lighter dry brushing colour, just to bring some of that wood colour back in where the greens may have gone on too heavily, and then we can move on to our foliage. I'll use a variety of different flocks depending on the different looks I'm going for. For my traditional tree here, I want quite a full crown, so I'll start by adding on some clump foliage, which is great for adding pure volume. Once that's on, I soak in some watered down PVA to the foliage and then dust on some fine flock while it's drying. And this step is doubly useful as it 1. Makes the foliage more solid and durable, and 2. Adds a nice bit of coloured variation with the flock so our trees end up looking a bit more varied and natural. For my pine tree it's the exact same process, except I'm using much more of a looser flock which is a lot less dense than the clump foliage. You can get specialised pine needle foliage, but honestly, from a distance, this stuff looks completely fine and is way easier to work with. Then again, give that a soaking with some PVA, scatter on some different coloured finer flock to add durability and coloured variation, and maybe give it a trim with your finest nostril hair trimming scissors to get rid of any bits which look unnatural. Lastly, for this gnarly old swamp tree, I'm using this green polyfiber stuff and draping little wisps of it over some branches with a dab of super glue to secure it. I think using it this way kind of looks like old man's beard, which is a kind of hanging lichen thing which can be found on loads of swampy trees, and I love the effect it gives. The super glue can leave little white splodges when it dries, so I'll pop on a little bit of watered down PVA and then dust on a tiny bit of fine flock just to cover that up. But yeah, you can use whatever flocks and foliages you like to get different looks for your trees, so have fun and experiment with different types. And if you have any unusual materials used for flocking your trees, let me know in a comment down below, as I'm always interested to try out different methods. But that is all she wrote, my friends. That is how I make trees for my dioramas and minis. As I mentioned at the start of this video, I think this technique is a great balance of all the different factors like affordability, time investment, and the look of the final product. And for me, it's the most fun of all the tree making techniques I've tried so far, because you're making them from scratch and they're fully customizable. You can make them exactly how you want them to be. And one more quick advantage of these trees before I head off is that you can continue bending and posing them once they're finished, since they're made of wire and the flexible glue. You might lose a bit of your dried texture paste if you bend them up too much, but small adjustments to fit in next to other trees or pieces of scenery are easily possible with these. So let me know if you have any questions about this process. I'll do my best to answer them, even if you ask 3 years after this is uploaded. And if you enjoyed this or learned anything, then please subscribe or leave a like to let me know. Thank you for watching, and I will see you very soon. See ya.
Tree?